When the police stopped Jacob, he knew this wasn't a routine check. But they made one crucial mistake. It was all on tape. What happened next shocked even seasoned investigators. Jacob, a young African-American man, was a 28-year-old undercover agent deeply involved in a risky investigation of corruption within the local police department. On the front lines of this battle, he knew his path would be fraught with danger and injustice. Recently, he had installed a hidden camera in his car, understanding that even the smallest detail could serve as key evidence to crack the case. His colleagues had warned him that certain officers in the local department, already familiar with him from past encounters, might pull him over without cause and attempt to create an incident. That evening, Jacob was driving home, tired after a long and intense day at work. Focused but slightly tense, he knew that any of his actions could be under surveillance. Just as he turned onto the main street in his neighborhood, a police car's flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. The siren blared, and Jacob's heart skipped a beat, though he was prepared for this moment. Calmly, he pulled over, turned off the engine, and took a deep breath, working to suppress any outward signs of emotion. Everything happening now was being recorded by the hidden camera he had carefully set up to capture every angle of the car. Two officers approached Jacob's car slowly. Rick Smith and Michael Grant were known for their hostility and bias. The officers seemed tense, showing aggression right away. Rick, a tall, muscular man in his 40s with sharp features, stopped in front of Jacob's door and smirked disdainfully. "Well, Jacob, decided to break the law tonight?" he sneered, his voice mocking and confrontational. Jacob met his gaze and answered calmly, without a trace of worry. He understood he'd been set up, but maintained his composure. Michael Grant, the second officer, stood just behind Rick, his posture and expression radiating hostility. This was a man with short dark hair and a cold stare, used to getting what he wanted at any cost. He scrutinized Jacob, as though looking for any sign of weakness. Knowing that any sudden movement or disobedience could be used against him, Jacob remained absolutely still. He politely asked, "How can I help, officer?" Internally, he realized this was the moment he had prepared for. The camera was capturing every detail. The officers' facial expressions, the tone of their voices, even their slightest movements. The officers began inspecting Jacob's documents, but their actions seemed intentionally prolonged and hostile. Jacob, fully aware something was wrong, continued to stay calm, sitting in his car and watching every move they made. Suddenly, without explanation or any reference to a violation, Rick Smith abruptly said, "Step out of the car." Knowing he had no choice, Jacob opened the door calmly and stepped out, mentally preparing for what was to come. "Hands on the roof of the car," Grant commanded sternly. The hidden camera continued recording, capturing not only the unfolding events, but also the officers' facial expressions. Jacob placed his hands on the roof and took a few deep breaths to steady himself. He could sense where this was heading, but he knew that his best defense now was to remain calm and follow instructions. Meanwhile, Rick and Michael exchanged a glance and began their search of the car. Without any warrant or explanation, Grant opened the car doors and started rummaging through Jacob's belongings, looking under the seats and in the glove compartment. Rick leaned over to his colleague and whispered with a smirk, "Let's make sure he's our next case report." Jacob overheard them and clenched his jaw, but he held back, knowing the hidden camera was capturing every word they said. As the officers continued to discuss how to frame Jacob, his suspicions were confirmed. Suddenly, Rick pulled a small baggie of drugs from his pocket and, with his back turned to the road, discreetly tossed it under the passenger seat. "Well, now we've got a reason to detain him," he muttered, tossing the baggie. Jacob saw it out of the corner of his eye and felt a wave of anger rise within him. He wanted to speak out, to stop them, but he knew that silence was his only weapon now. Jacob stood motionless, projecting submission, though inside he was filled with fear, anger, and bitterness. The camera kept recording, and Jacob mentally thanked himself for installing it. After Rick planted the baggie of drugs, the officers exchanged satisfied glances and turned to Jacob abruptly. Grant smirked and announced, "Jacob, you're under arrest for possession of illegal substances." His voice was cold and formal, as if relishing every second of the false accusation. Jacob, outwardly calm, took a deep breath, fully understanding that this accusation was their attempt to destroy his reputation. Rick stepped closer, holding handcuffs ready, about to place them on Jacob, when he calmly said, "Before you go any further, I'd like to call my attorney." The officers, assuming this was a standard request, didn't object, but Jacob, maintaining absolute calm, dialed his lawyer and briefly explained the situation, emphasizing the hidden camera recording in his car. The officers' expressions shifted instantly, and their confidence melted into anxiety. "A camera? Your car recorded this?" Grant asked, visibly shaken. Jacob looked him straight in the eye, his gaze cool and steady. "Yes, there's a recording of everything you've done," he replied calmly. His words exposed their fear immediately, and they realized that their actions, intentions, and words had all been documented. Rick shifted uneasily, rubbing his forehead as he struggled to find a way out. He muttered something to Grant, desperately trying to come up with an excuse. Grant, having lost his former confidence, tried to keep his composure, but his tense gaze and abrupt movements gave him away. Jacob watched their panic with quiet satisfaction, understanding that the truth was now on his side. "You should have been more careful," Jacob said clearly and precisely, adding with a hint of irony, "Your careers are now at risk." These words, spoken without a trace of emotion, seemed to cut straight into their consciousness. The officers understood that their careers, and maybe even their freedom, were now hanging by a thread. After Jacob's arrest and his call to his attorney, an intense investigation began. Over the next few weeks, thorough examinations were conducted, and the hidden camera in Jacob's car became the primary evidence confirming the accusations against officers Rick Smith and Michael Grant. Realizing the gravity of the evidence, the police department decided to suspend the officers pending an official inquiry. The decision stirred mixed emotions in the department. Some colleagues supported Jacob, understanding that such methods of justice tarnished the entire police force's reputation, while others worried that cases like these could erode public trust in law enforcement overall. When the case reached court, it caused a massive public outcry. Local media picked up the story, highlighting details of the investigation and the abuses of power within the police department. Articles and TV reports emphasized how such incidents undermine public trust in law enforcement and reveal issues of systemic corruption. Every news segment became a platform for debate, and social media flooded with comments from outraged citizens demanding justice. Jacob was no longer just a witness, but a symbol of the fight for justice against corruption. Inspired by his resilience, many began to speak out about their own experiences of injustice, amplifying the impact of his case. In the courtroom, Jacob stood as a confident and honest witness, recounting everything that had happened that night. Coolly, he presented the hidden camera footage, exposing Rick and Michael's methods in front of the judge and jury. The recording showed how the officers planted drugs, discussed covering their tracks, and then falsely accused Jacob, using him as a scapegoat. The footage evoked a mixture of anger and horror among viewers. Police deceit, concealed behind the law's facade, had been laid bare. Public interest in the case grew daily. Jacob received support from activists and public figures who saw in his struggle an example for others who had also been wronged by the system. His story became a symbol not only of exposure, but of hope for change. People discussed his case on the streets, and many joined protests calling for police reform and more transparent oversight mechanisms for law enforcement. The story's conclusion carries a deep moral lesson. Thanks to Jacob's efforts and the public support, the police department underwent serious changes. New control and accountability rules were introduced, anti-bias training was implemented, and the role of independent observers was strengthened. Jacob remains in the public's memory as a man who found the strength to stand for justice, even when it seemed the system was against him. His story proves that despite inequality and danger, the fight for truth can change society for the better, inspiring others to act for justice and equality.